Enough talk, he growled. If the mother will not surrender the child, then we will take him by force. With that, he lunged toward Iyanga, spear aimed at her heart. The crowd gasped, but before the spear could strike, Obika sent Kalu flying, and Kalu was thrown backward, his weapon clattering to the ground. Kalu rose to his feet, his face twisted in rage. "See," he shouted, pointing at the child. "He is no human. He is a demon." The village of Omidon stood proud under the shadow of towering mountains, its people revered for their extraordinary offspring, tall, strong, and brave. Tales of Omidon's warriors, defenders of the kingdom, were sung in distant lands. But behind their renown lay a secret, guarded by the tribe's elders for generations. True love was the only seed that could produce children with such extraordinary gifts. Most suitors, unaware of this truth, came to Omidon only to sire mighty heirs, not for love. When their marriages were based on deceit or ambition, the children born of these unions were ordinary, lacking the strength and power Omidon was known for. This deception had bred mistrust among the women of Omidon. Families grew cautious, probing suitors' true intentions before giving their daughters' hands in marriage. Yet marriages born of convenience persisted, and the secret's impact was felt in hushed whispers about dwindling numbers of strong heirs. There is a woman named Iyanga, a proud descendant of Omidon, who was once a radiant young woman full of hope. Her first marriage was an extravagant affair, celebrated by the whole village. But the years passed, and no child came. Whispers followed her wherever she went. Omidon women were never barren. The tribe's pride was built on their fertility and strength. What made Iyanga different? Her husband, once enamored by her beauty, grew distant, his gaze turning cold with blame. After 2 years of childlessness, he left her, leaving her broken, stigmatized, and a source of shame to her family. She had to move back to her family house, and that was one of the most shameful things a lady could do. Months passed, and Iyanga struggled to even make friends or interact, not until she met Deji. You see, Deji was the definition of a perfect gentleman. He was tall, handsome, and happens to be every lady's dream. They grew fond of each other, and Deji developed likeness for Iyanga. Despite all the discouraging words from friend and family, Deji proclaimed his love for Iyanga. He asked for her hand, and the villagers mocked him. "A barren bride," they said. "What good is she to you?" But Deji loved Iyanga deeply. He saw her strength, her courage, and the sadness in her heart, and he swore to protect her from the cruelty of others. Their love blossomed, genuine and unshaken. Still, after 4 years of marriage, the absence of children weighed heavily on their hearts. Each passing season deepened their sorrow. Iyanga wept in silence, blaming herself, while Deji reassured her that their bundle of joy was just around the corner. Yet even his love couldn't silence the voices of the villagers who murmured. It was on the eve of Omidon's annual Warriors Festival, where families with the strongest children were honored by the king, that the prophecy came. The chief oracle, an ancient figure who rarely spoke of individuals, summoned Iyanga and Deji to the sacred grove. The villagers watched with curiosity. The oracle, draped in ceremonial robes, spoke in a voice that seemed to echo with the wind.
"Iyanga of Omidon, the child you seek will come. But know this, your firstborn shall open the way for others. Yet this child will be unlike any other, strange, powerful, and feared by many."
Iyanga and Deji exchanged glances, their hope rekindled and their fear growing in equal measure. "What do you mean by strange?" Deji asked, his voice trembling.
"The child will be a blessing and a curse. It will bring greatness, but also trials. Prepare yourselves, for the path will not be easy."
As they returned to the village, the prophecy spread like wildfire. Some saw it as a miracle, others as an omen of doom. For Iyanga and Deji, it was the first flicker of hope they had known in years, even as uncertainty gnawed at them. Months passed, and Iyanga's belly swelled with life. The villagers, still torn between curiosity and fear, watched her closely. On the night of her labor, a storm, unlike any Omidon had ever seen, swept through the village. The winds howled, and the sky turned an unnatural shade of red. As Oyema held her hand in the dim hut, her cries echoed through the village. The midwives exchanged worried glances, whispering about the unnatural energy in the air. When the child was born, a hush fell over the room. The baby let out a wail so piercing it seemed to shake the walls. He had icy blue eyes that seemed to glow faintly, and faint, shifting markings on his skin. Even the midwives, seasoned women who had delivered hundreds of Omidon children, stepped back in fear. "This is no ordinary child," one of them whispered. "This is the prophecy fulfilled." Some villagers, haunted by old legends, begin to whisper that the child is a demon, a being cursed to bring suffering. The news spread quickly. The villagers gathered outside Iyanga's home, demanding to see the child. When they did, their fear turned to anger. "This is not one of us," they cried. "This child is a demon. It will bring doom to Omidon." A couple of months later, the king summoned Iyanga and Deji, demanding an explanation. "Your child," he said, his voice heavy with authority, "is no warrior of Omidon. What manner of spirit have you brought into our village?" Iyanga stood tall, her love for her child outweighing her fear. "This child is a gift," she said firmly. "A gift born of true love, as the oracle foretold. He is my first seed, my king. I wish no evil." But the king issued a decree. The child was to be tested. If he proved to be dangerous, he would be banished or worse. The king's decree left Iyanga and Deji with little choice. They agreed to subject their son, whom they had named Obika, born of strength, to the village's tests. These trials were traditionally meant for Omidon warriors to prove their worth. But now they were used to determine if Obika was a danger. The first test was the strength trial, where the child, still an infant, was to lift a ceremonial warrior staff. To everyone's astonishment, Obika gripped the staff with his tiny hands and raised it. The second test was the trial of courage, where a lion, tamed by the village elders, was brought before the child. Instead of crying, Obika locked his glowing blue eyes with the beast, and the lion lowered itself, bowing to the infant as though recognizing a superior force. The final test was the trial of submission, meant to determine if the child could be controlled. Obika, now visibly agitated, refused to follow any commands. Instead, he yearned for his parents. The sky above the village darkened unnaturally, and winds tore through the ceremonial grounds. Shadows seemed to writhe around the child as if obeying his will. The villagers, convinced the child was cursed. The king, shaken by the display, declared, "This child is no Omidon warrior. He is a being possessed with power beyond our understanding. He cannot live." Immediately the king said that the sky was heavy with storm clouds, thunder rumbling in the distance, as Iyanga stood at the center of the grove, clutching her son, Obika, tightly to her chest. The weather began to return back to its normal state. The king then said, "If you love Omidon, you will surrender him." Deji stepped forward, defiance burning in his eyes. "He is my son," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. "You fear him because you do not understand him." The villagers murmured among themselves, their whispers rising like the wind. Some nodded in agreement, but others shouted, The boy is a demon child. He must be stopped. Kalu, a trusted warrior of Omidon, stepped forward. He was a towering figure, scarred from years of battle, his spear glinting in the faint sunlight. "Enough talk!" he growled. "If the mother will not surrender the child, then we will take him by force." With that, he lunged toward Iyanga, spear aimed at her heart. The crowd gasped, but before the spear could strike, Obika sent Kalu flying, and Kalu was thrown backward, his weapon clattering to the ground. Kalu rose to his feet, his face twisted in rage. "See!" he shouted, pointing at the child. "He is no human. He is a demon." Torn between his duty and the growing fear in his heart. But when more warriors stepped forward, emboldened by Kalu's words, he gave a reluctant nod. "Capture them," he commanded, though his voice wavered. The warriors surged forward, their weapons gleaming as they advanced on Iyanga. She backed away, holding Obika tightly, her heart pounding. "Stay away from him!" she shouted, but her voice was drowned out by the roar of the warriors. Deji was busy fighting some warriors off suddenly from the trees. A swarm of bats descended, their wings beating like thunder. They swirled around the warriors, clawing at their faces and sending them into disarray. The grove was a cacophony of screams and chaos. As the battle raged, Iyanga fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "Obika, please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You don't have to fight them. Stop this." The child turned to her, his glowing eyes softening for a moment. The shadows hesitated, their movements slowing, as though waiting for his command. Kalu, bloodied but unrelenting, charged forward, his sword drawn. "If no one else has the courage, I will end this myself," he roared, leaping through the swirling shadows. The bats scattered as he swung his blade, aiming for Obika. But before the strike could land, the earth beneath him erupted. Thick roots, gnarled and ancient, burst from the ground, wrapping around his legs and arms. He struggled, his screams of rage turning to terror as the roots tightened, dragging him to his knees. "Obika, no!" Iyanga shouted, pulling her son close. "This is not who you are." The shadows hesitated, trembling as if caught between obedience and restraint. Slowly they receded, melting back into the earth. The bats disappeared, and the grove fell eerily silent. The king stepped forward, his face pale but resolute. "Enough," he said, raising his hand. His voice carried authority, but also a note of regret. "Iyanga, your child is no ordinary being, but you are right, fear should not rule us." He turned to the crowd, his voice firm. "This child will not be harmed, but neither can he remain here, Deji. You must take him far from Omidon. He is therefore banished." Iyanga's heart broke, but she nodded. She knew this was the only way to protect her son. Holding Obika tightly, and with Deji beside her, she whispered, "We will go. But remember this, one day you will need him. And when that day comes, I hope you have the courage to face him." As Deji, Iyanga, and Obika disappeared into the forest, the villagers watched in silence, their faces a mixture of relief and unease. The king turned to his warriors, his expression heavy. "We have avoided disaster today," he said, "but I fear this is not the last we will see of them." In the distance, thunder rumbled, and the storm clouds began to part. But even as the light returned, the memory of the battle lingered, a dark shadow over Omidon's future. You see, some months ago, before Deji came into Iyanga life, she had a dream. In that dream, Iyanga sat at the edge of the forest, broken and alone. She had wandered there in a moment of weakness, consumed by the shame of being barren in a village where fertility was revered. She sobbed uncontrollably, her voice echoing in the quiet night. "Why me?" she cried, looking to the heavens. What have I done to deserve this? Her tears fell onto the earth, soaking the roots of an ancient tree. The forest, which had been eerily still, seemed to come alive. A cold wind whispered through the trees, carrying her cries deeper into the woods. A faint sound of a baby's cry echoed in the distance. Iyanga froze, her breath hitching. "Who's there?" she called out, fear mixing with curiosity. She stepped deeper into the forest, following the sound, her despair making her reckless. At the heart of the forest, she came upon a clearing bathed in an unnatural light. A woman stood there, draped in a flowing, otherworldly garment, her face serene and radiant. Iyanga was captivated, her pain momentarily forgotten. "Child of Omidon," the woman said, in a voice that was both comforting and unnerving. "Why do you weep?" Iyanga whispered. "I cannot bear children. I have no purpose. My people have cast me aside." The woman stepped closer, her presence both calming and overwhelming. She said, "You are chosen. Your womb is special, Iyanga, and it has been waiting for the right seed. I can help you, if you are willing." Iyanga's heart leaped. "Can you help me have a child?" "Yes," the woman said, a smile playing on her lips. "A child, unlike any other. A child who will bring honor and strength to your name. But you must promise to nurture this child with love and courage, for they will carry a heavy burden." Blinded by hope, Iyanga nodded eagerly. "I will do anything." The woman placed a hand on Iyanga's belly, and a strange warmth spread through her. It was at this point she woke up. It wasn't until the oracle summoned Iyanga that she began to understand the full extent of what had happened to her. Back to the present. That night, as Iyanga cradled her newborn, a cold wind swept through the room. A gentle voice in her ears spoke. "I told you this child would be powerful," the spirit said. "But beware, Iyanga, power is a double-edged sword. He will be feared, hated, and hunted. Your love alone will decide if he becomes a savior or a destroyer." The voice vanished, leaving Iyanga alone with her child, her heart heavy with the weight of the prophecy. She looked into his glowing eyes, vowing to raise him with all the love she had, even as she feared the darkness that lurked within. The secluded valley had been a haven for Iyanga, Deji, and Obika, a quiet refuge from the whispers and threats of Omidon. The surrounding mountains shielded them, and the dense forest provided everything they needed. For months, they lived peacefully, with Iyanga and Deji building a life around their son, who was growing faster than any ordinary child. At just a year old, Obika's eyes shone with a quiet intensity, and his uncanny powers continued to manifest in small but awe-inspiring ways. Animals would gather around him, as though drawn by an invisible force. But as much as Iyanga and Deji tried to embrace their new life, they knew the peace couldn't last. The story of Obika's birth and powers had traveled far, carried by the fearful whispers of merchants and travelers. The pale light of the moon cast an eerie glow over the secluded valley, where Iyanga, Deji, and Obika had found refuge. The serenity of the night was pierced by the rustle of leaves and the faint clinking of metal. Shadows moved stealthily among the tree's hunters, clad in dark leather, armed with spears, swords, and nets. They moved like predators, their eyes scanning the valley with singular focus. These were not ordinary men. They were warriors dispatched by nearby kingdoms, drawn by the tales of Obika's power. In the hands of their leader was a ring. It was crafted with inscriptions glowing faintly, a relic of ancient times said to possess the power to cage beings like Obika. Once placed around his neck, the ring would suppress his abilities, rendering him helpless. The hunters knew that to control Obika was to control a force capable of shifting the balance of power among kingdoms. Failure was not an option. The hunters whispered among themselves as they approached the tent house where the family lived. "The child must not be underestimated," one of them murmured, gripping his spear tightly. "He's just an infant," another scoffed. "How dangerous could he be?" The leader silenced them with a glare. "Fools! If provoked, he could transform into something none of us are prepared for. The ring is our only hope of survival and control." Their mission was clear. Place the ring around Obika's neck. This would bind his powers and make him a prisoner, a tool to be wielded by the kingdom that claimed him. But even the bravest among them felt a chill at the thought of what might happen if they failed. Iyanga woke first, her maternal instincts alerting her to the presence of danger. She shook Deji awake, her voice trembling. "They're here," she whispered. Deji's eyes narrowed as he grabbed his spear. "Take Obika and hide," he said, his voice firm despite the fear in his heart. "I'll hold them off." "No," Iyanga protested, clutching Deji tightly. "We face this together." Before they could act, the hunters emerged from the shadows, encircling their home. Their leader stepped forward, holding the glowing ring aloft. "Surrender the child, and no harm will come to you," he commanded, his voice cold and authoritative. With tears streaming down her face, Iyanga scooped Obika into her arms and ran toward the cave hidden behind a waterfall at the edge of the valley. Obika, sensing the tension, clung to her silently, his glowing eyes scanning the dark forest as if aware of the danger. One hunter, faster than the others, broke away from the group and lunged at Iyanga, the ring in his hand. But before he could reach her, a surge of plants erupted from the ground, knocking him off his feet. Obika's cries grew louder, and the shadows twisted and writhed like living entities, forming a protective barrier around him and Iyanga. The hunters surged forward, their weapons gleaming in the moonlight. Deji fought with the ferocity of a man defending his family, his spear striking true against the first wave of attackers. Iyanga, clutching Obika, retreated toward the dense forest, her heart pounding as the sounds of battle filled the night. He managed to take down two of them, his spear striking with precision. But the numbers were against him. A blade grazed his side, and a net was thrown over him. He tore through it, but the distraction allowed another hunter to strike, slashing his shoulder. Blood soaked his tunic, but Deji refused to fall. As Iyanga reached the cave, she set Obika down and turned to watch the battle from a distance, her heart breaking as she saw Deji surrounded. She wanted to run to him, to fight beside him, but she knew she couldn't risk exposing Obika. Obika, sensing the danger, began to cry. His markings glowed faintly, and the air around them grew heavy. Iyanga whispered to him, trying to soothe him, but the energy emanating from the child was palpable. The hunters hesitated, their courage faltering as the supernatural force grew stronger. "The child! He's awakening!" one of them shouted, panic evident in his voice. The leader snarled, "Find him and place the ring around his neck now!" But it was too late. Obika's power, though uncontrolled, surged in waves, shaking the very ground beneath them. The hunters were thrown back, their weapons clattering to the ground. Obika had proven himself to be everything the legends warned of and more. The kingdom that captured him would wield unparalleled power. Obika, however, seemed to sense his father's peril. He looked up at Iyanga, his glowing blue eyes narrowing with an intensity she had never seen before. The air around him grew heavy, and the shadows in the cave began to shift and move, as though alive. "Obika." "No," Iyanga whispered, realizing what was happening. But it was too late. The shadows stretched out from the cave like dark tendrils, snaking across the forest floor toward the hunters. The ground beneath the attackers began to tremble, and the trees groaned as their roots twisted unnaturally. The hunters froze, their confidence turning to fear as the shadows coiled around their legs and arms, pulling them down. The earth itself seemed to rise against them. Rocks and roots erupted from the ground, striking with precision. One hunter screamed as a tendril of shadow wrapped around his neck, lifting him off the ground before throwing him into a tree. Deji, battered and bloodied, looked on in awe as the hunters fled in terror, their formation broken. But even as they retreated, one of them hurled a dagger, its blade glinting as it flew through the air. The dagger struck Deji in the side, embedding deep. He staggered, his spear falling from his hands as he sank to his knees. Meanwhile, inside the cave, Iyanga held Obika tightly to her chest, whispering soothing words. His tiny body trembled, his markings glowing faintly. But as her soft words reached him, the glow began to fade. The tension in the air slowly dissipated. Iyanga's heartbeat, once frantic, began to steady. She rocked him gently, her motherly instincts overpowering her own fears. The forest was eerily silent, save for the panicked footsteps of the retreating hunter. "Shh, my son. It's over now," she murmured, stroking his head. Her voice was barely audible over the sound of her own labored breathing. The child's cries softened into sniffles, and soon he was quiet, his little hands clutching at her as though seeking protection. But the silence that followed was unnerving. Iyanga's ears strained to catch any sound of movement outside. Where was Deji? Her heart, which had just begun to calm, now raced again with a new kind of fear. Gently placing Obika down on a soft patch of leaves inside the cave, she wiped her tears and stood. "Deji," she called, stepping cautiously toward the cave's entrance. The forest seemed to swallow her voice, echoing it back in a mocking tone. "Deji," she called again, louder this time, her desperation growing. Iyanga stepped out into the moonlit forest, the shadows of the trees stretching long and menacing across the ground. She scanned the area, her eyes darting between the trees. Nothing. No sign of Deji, not even the faintest rustle of leaves or the gleam of his spear. "No, no, no," she sobbed, clutching the dirt in her hands. The weight of everything crashed down on her, the attack, the hunters, the storm, and now this. "Deji, don't leave us!" she screamed, her voice filled with anguish. Her cries echoed through the forest, carrying her pain into the night. She pounded the ground with her fists, her tears carving streaks down her dirt-streaked face. Obika, sensing his mother's anguish, emerged from the cave. But it wasn't the same Obika she had cradled just moments ago. He no longer crawled like an infant. He walked with steady, deliberate steps, his small frame now that of a much older child. His glowing markings shimmered faintly, their once threatening aura replaced by a soft, calming light that radiated warmth and serenity, bathing Iyanga in its gentle embrace. Iyanga froze, her body trembling as she turned toward the glow. Her tear-filled eyes widened, disbelief etched across her face as she beheld the impossible sight before her. "Obika," she whispered, her voice shaking with a mix of wonder and fear. Her son, her tiny baby, whom she had held so tightly, now stood before her, his gaze steady, his expression calm yet knowing. The weight of the moment stole her breath, her mind racing to grasp what she was seeing. She reached out a trembling hand as if to confirm he was real. Obika stepped closer, his glowing markings pulsing gently, as if responding to her pain. When his small arms reached for her, the sight shattered her composure. She pulled him into her arms with a desperate urgency, cradling him as though he might slip away again. "My son," she choked, her voice breaking with emotion. Her sobs quieted, though tears still fell, her disbelief melting into a raw and fierce love. Holding him close, she felt the warmth of his glow seep into her, calming the storm of her anguish. Yet deep in her heart, the questions loomed. What had happened to her child? And what did it mean for the journey ahead? "We'll find him," she whispered, more to herself than to Obika. The disappearance of Deji leaves a lingering mystery. But Iyanga knew the fight was far from over. Word of Obika's powers would spread, and more would come. The battle for her son's future had only just begun.